My guest is Bernie Farber. He's CEO of the Canadian Jewish Congress. Welcome back to the show, Bernie.
Thank you.
Now, you've been on this show and lots of other shows at CTS and all over the place. You've been on television a lot. What importance do you see of your role on TV, of our being a TV program on the Jewish community in Israel?
Well, my role on TV, well, number one good thing is that my children get to see me a little bit more often. So that's kind of helpful. But as a kind of a spokesperson for the community, I become a familiar face, which I think allows people a sense of comfort that there's one person out there who is trying to reflect the main view of the community. So that's helpful and it's comfortable for the community. More importantly, when we have a show like Israel Today, which I've appeared on a number of occasions and spoken on a myriad of issues, from being a child of Holocaust survivors to working in a very complicated community. It becomes, in a way, Howard, a marketplace for members of our community to tune in and to see what's going on. It's easy to be able to do that. It means you turn on a television set. It's located nicely on the dial. And I think people still relate to images. It's quick. It's easy to listen to, and it's comfortable again to listen to. So there is that entire sense of comfort that I think is very, very important. The other thing is, and I find this interesting just for myself, and I think you'll be pleased to hear it, when your show runs, I will come into the office and people will say to me, "Did you see Israel Today?" And others will say, "You know, I didn't know it was on, but as I was clicking through the channels, I saw Bernie, or I saw Professor so-and-so, or personalities within the community. And so I stopped and I watched it." And I hear that so often, which says to me that people do get engaged and they find it easy to find you on the channel. And so, the show itself has become a show to watch in terms of getting information, hearing what's going on out there, and not just getting one-sided information, which I think is very important in terms of your show. You have been able to reflect the left and the right and what I call the extreme middle. And I think you've done it fairly. I think you've done it accurately. You've had some very interesting and sometimes provocative guests. And yet at the same time, you've been able to maintain a balance. And for our community, especially in a time where we are facing some complicated struggles, the ability to be able to maintain that balance and create a sense of understanding is so important. So the show to me is a bit of a treasure, I have to tell you.
Well, I just let you go because you were so flattering. You have to come more often.
Anytime.
Anyway, I want to thank you very much for coming on, and of course you'll be on again. Thanks very much.
It's my pleasure. Thank you.
My guest is Barry Rubin. He's the director of Gloria and also the editor of Maria. Welcome back.
Thank you.
Barry, I want to use Saudi Arabia to give a quick picture of the history of the Middle East, because Saudi Arabia is central and we have limited time. And I want to go back to 1970 and the oil embargo crisis. Does that set off a whole new phase in the Middle East in your mind?
Well, I guess you could say that.
You don't sound very convinced.
Well, the problem is, it's funny because, you're dealing with a region that has so many dramatic developments and turning points. And look, the problem of every country has a different mix of factors. The problem, obviously, with Saudi Arabia is, on the one hand, it has a lot of money, and that gives it a kind of power, money from oil and natural gas. On the other hand, it has a very small population. It's not so technologically advanced in terms of what it can do, and it's militarily weak. So how then do the Saudis function? They're very cautious. They're very conservative. They try to use their money to buy off threats, but they don't want to go too far. They realize that they're surrounded by radical regimes, and they want to buy them off or get someone to fight them for them. In their ideas, they're extremely, extremely, extremely radical, but in their actions, they're more cautious. Now, the Saudi problem is that to their east, they had a series of threats. Historically, it was Iraq under Saddam Hussein. And so they tried to buy him off. But then they had a very nasty shock in August of 1990 when Saddam invaded Kuwait. So they had to turn to the West in order to save them. But now, with Saddam is gone, the threat is Iran. They on a geopolitical level, they feel threatened with Iran, and they basically do not like Shia Muslims. Saudi Arabia is a strongly Sunni Muslim state, although it has 10% Shia Muslim population.
But
so they're terrified by the growing power of Iran.
But didn't they also, in the 70s, because you're talking about
but we only have a few minutes, right. So we should really focus perhaps more on what's most relevant for today.
Well, I was thinking that we'll come back to that, but in the history of it, the occupation of the mosque, the Great Mosque, which is, I thought, was a big trauma for Saudi Arabia, was it not? And with the Shiites and the rebellion of the Shiites.
Yeah, sure.
Then?
I mean, sure. They're worried about the revolutionary Islamism. They're worried about, instability. But even without those events, they have enough, reasons to worry. And now they ask themselves the question, okay, how are we going to survive? Being Saudi Arabia is like being a very big bank with a lot of money and and not very good guard system. So they basically have two choices. They can come to the West and say, we want you to protect us, or they can appease Iran. And if the West doesn't make a credible show that it's really serious about facing Iran and Syria, its junior partner, then what are the Saudis going to do? They're going to have to go to appeasement in order to protect themselves. And what are they going to do when Iran has nuclear weapons? Are they going to trust the United States and President Barack Obama to protect them? Do they believe that the United States would go to war and even credibly threaten to use nuclear weapons on Iran to protect them? And they have to feel very insecure. One of the initiatives the Saudis did take, which for them is a very big initiative, is over Lebanon. They don't want the Syrians and the Iranians to take over Lebanon. And they did a lot of stuff behind the scenes, and they got no Western support. The irony here is that even though on one level, Saudi Arabia in some ways is anti-Semitic, they're anti-Jewish, they hate Israel, but on another level, they don't want to get into a war with Israel, and they increasingly, in private, not in public, don't see Israel as a big threat to them.
But the FOD plan explicitly and overtly says they'll recognize Israel if they make peace and solve the Palestinian problem. So that's overt, it's not just...
That was one of their initiatives. However, it's very important. People don't understand the Fahad plan was not accepted. The Arab plan that came out of the Fahad plan came out of it after Saddam Hussein's regime and the Syrian government made certain amendments in it. So as it emerged, it's not so great. But yes, because basically, on one level, the Saudis would like someone else to settle the conflict for them so they don't have to worry about it. On the other hand, though, they're not going to play much of a contributory role toward doing that. But if they want the conflict solved, it's because they want to be able to focus on the real threat to them, which is mostly external right now, to some extent internal, which is revolutionaryism. We should remember that there is a man who puts himself up as the Islamist leader of Saudi Arabia. His name is Osama bin Laden. People don't realize that before September 11th and continuing for some years after that, the main emphasis of Osama bin Laden was the overthrow of the Saudi regime.
But isn't there then a subterranean, with not being overt and not being expressed, common interest between Israel and Saudi Arabia that encourages cooperation but not overt cooperation?
That's exactly right.
Well, I got one right.
But I don't want to use the word cooperation. I say parallel interests, because there isn't going to be direct cooperation. But for example, I mean, the Saudis want Israel to attack Iranian nuclear installation. I think the Saudis want Israel to do it more than Israel wants to do it. But they understand what their interests are. Now, they can't always act on them. But I mean, when you see a scene, and again, this is the most important stuff, doesn't get in the media or isn't recognized. Secretary of State Hillary Clinton goes to Saudi Arabia. Standing next to her is the Saudi foreign minister, who is a prince in the family. And he says, sanctions against Iran will take too long. You've got to do something now. And no one so what does that mean? What is he saying? You know, and meanwhile, sanctions get drawn and drawn longer and longer. So this is the voice.
But if
of the
you
Saudis.
say if you say the U.S. isn't going to do anything and bomb Iran, and
I'm not saying
maybe
they
even
should.
And Israel isn't going to do it, what does Saudi Arabia do? Does it continue the policy of trying to buy off its enemies?
Sure.
And if so, it goes down the other stream, doesn't it?
Well, they can
it doesn't succeed very well.
Well, you can always do more than one thing at a time. So you maximize your defense. You go to the U.S., you go to the West, you ask for reassurances and stronger forces and guarantees. And at the same time, you appease Iran. What does it mean to appease Iran? Not to do anything Iran doesn't like. Certainly you don't make peace with Israel. Certainly you don't cooperate too much with the West. Certainly you don't intervene too much against the spread of Islamism in other countries. This is not a good situation. And it goes with my main theme, which is that the West is subverting the moderates and helping the radicals. And what I am saying is the common dialogue inside the Middle East. If you read the best Arabic language newspapers, if you listen to what leaders saying, if you talk to people in private and they trust you and you're not a journalist who's going to report what they say, this is the way people talk. And this conversation does not get across in the West for a variety of reasons. The irony is that today, in real terms, Western intellectuals and media are much more obsessed with Israeli-Palestinian conflict than are most of the Arab leaders. That people in the West believe that they can moderate Iran and Syria and maybe Hamas and Hezbollah, and people do not believe that among the Arab leaders. So you've got two totally different kind of systems of discussion and priorities going on, and one of them is the one in the Middle East is more accurate.
We're going to end on that note. Thank you very much, Barry.